The middle pillar, Science and the Sacred presents The Imbalance of Ego, the Architecture of Self, written and narrated by Daniel M. Tanguay. Copyright 2026, The Middle Pillar Society. All rights reserved. This audiobook is licensed for personal transformation and private listening only. Unauthorized reproduction, distribution, or public performance is strictly prohibited. The voice that calls itself I.
Before we can speak about awakening, we have to speak about the one who wants to awaken. The I. The voice in the mind that says, "This is me, this is mine, this is what happened, this is what I believe, this is what I must protect." That voice is not evil. It is not a mistake in the human design. It is not some spiritual enemy that needs to be hunted down and destroyed. It is a structure. It is an architecture. The ego is the organizing center of personal identity. It gives us a name, a history, a sense of continuity, and a way to move through the world without dissolving into chaos every morning. It helps us remember what happened yesterday, plan for tomorrow, protect the body, form relationships, make decisions, and survive inside a social world filled with danger, beauty, pressure, and belonging. Without some sense of self, we could not function. But there is a difference between having an ego and being ruled by it. There's a difference between using the self as a tool and mistaking the tool for the whole of who we are. That difference is where the imbalance begins. The ego was meant to help awareness navigate the world. It was never meant to become the world. The inner narrator inside nearly every human being lives a narrator. It comments, it remembers, it compares, it worries, it explains, it defends, it tells us who we are supposed to be. This narrator can be useful. It can help us make sense of experience. It can turn memory into meaning. It can help us learn from pain and organize the raw material of life into a story we can carry. But the narrator has a flaw. It speaks as if it is reality itself. It does not usually say, "Here is one interpretation." It says, "This is the truth." And because the voice is inside us, we believe it. A thought arises and we call it me. A memory appears and we call it my story. A fear tightens the body, and we call it intuition. A judgment forms, and we call it discernment. A belief feels familiar, and we call it truth. This is not because we are foolish. It is because the self is built from patterns that repeat until they feel permanent. A child is not born with a fully formed identity. The child is named, reflected, corrected, praised, shamed, compared, loved, wounded, taught what is safe and what is dangerous. Over time, these experiences gather into a living structure. That structure becomes the self we recognize. But recognition is not the same as essence. The self we defend is often a construction made from memory, language, trauma, culture, family systems, survival strategies, and stories we inherited before we were old enough to question them. This does not make the self false in a cheap or dismissive way. It makes the self provisional, real as an experience, useful as an interface, limited as an ultimate identity.
Language as architecture.
Language does more than describe the self. Language helps build it. Words like I, me, and mine are necessary. They help us communicate. They help us take responsibility. They help us distinguish our body, our needs, our choices, and our boundaries from those of others. But language also divides. The moment the mind says I, it quietly creates a center. The moment it says mine, it creates a boundary. The moment it says not me, it creates distance. Again, this is not wrong. Boundaries matter. Identity matters. A human being without boundaries is not enlightened. They are unprotected. But when language hardens, reality becomes carved into fragments, self and other, human and nature, body and spirit, sacred and ordinary, winner and loser, right and wrong, us and them. The ego loves these divisions because they make the world feel manageable. They give the mind handles. They reduce mystery into categories. But the sacred does not always fit inside categories. Life does not arrive already divided into the boxes our language creates. Reality is more fluid than our words. The map is useful, but it is not the territory. This is one of the central lessons of the middle pillar. Science is the map. The sacred is the territory. The middle pillar is the bridge. Language belongs to the map. Experience belongs to the territory. Wisdom learns how to honor both.
The neuroscience of the self.
Modern neuroscience offers a helpful lens for understanding the inner narrator, but we need to use it carefully. One network often discussed in relation to self-referential thought is the default mode network, or DMN. This network is associated with inward-facing mental activity, autobiographical memory, self-reflection, future planning, rumination, and the ongoing sense of me moving through time. That does not mean the DMN is the ego's seat. The self is not sitting in one little room in the brain wearing a crown. The brain is more complex than that. Identity emerges through the interaction of many systems: memory, emotion, bodily sensation, social perception, language, attention, and prediction. The DMN is an important part of this larger process, especially when the mind turns inward and builds the story of the self. When balanced, this self-referential capacity is useful. It helps us learn from the past and imagine the future. When imbalanced, it can become a loop. The mind rehearses old wounds. It compares itself to others. It predicts rejection before connection has a chance. It defends beliefs because being wrong feels like being threatened. It mistakes the story for the soul. Anyone who has lived with shame, anxiety, grief, trauma, addiction, or obsessive self-criticism knows this loop intimately. The narrator becomes loud. The body becomes tight. The world becomes filtered through threat. The self becomes something we must constantly protect. This is where psychology and spirituality begin to touch. Psychology helps us understand how the self was built. Spiritual practice helps us experience that we are more than what was built. One does not replace the other. We need both. Before delving deeper into ego, defensiveness, and dissolution, we need to pause and name the different lenses at play here.
Science, philosophy, metaphor, and direct experience.
A chapter like this has to hold several kinds of truth without confusing them. Science can describe patterns in the brain, nervous system, development, trauma, behavior, and attention. It can help us understand some of the ways identity is shaped, how threat responses can influence perception, and why self-referential loops can become so painful. Philosophy can ask what the self is, whether identity is fixed or fluid, and how much of me is memory, language, relation, and interpretation. Metaphor can make these ideas livable: the ego as architecture, the self as a mask, awareness as a river. These images are not laboratory claims, they are bridges for understanding. Direct experience is what happens when the concept becomes personal. The moment someone notices the narrator instead of obeying it, the moment a belief loosens, the moment a defensive pattern softens, the moment the body realizes it is safe enough to stop fighting. The middle pillar does not need to collapse these into one category. It can let each lens do its proper work. Science helps us stay honest. Philosophy helps us question deeply. Metaphor helps us feel what the mind alone cannot hold. Direct experience helps the teaching become real. With those lenses separated, the next step is compassion. If the ego is an architecture, then we have to ask what it was built to protect.
Ego as protection.
It is easy in spiritual spaces to speak harshly about the ego. Kill the ego, destroy the ego, get rid of the self. But this language can be careless, especially for people with trauma. For many people, the ego is not arrogance. It is armor. It is the structure that formed around pain so the person could survive. It learned to control because life felt unsafe. It learned to perform because love felt conditional. It learned to defend because vulnerability once led to harm. It learned to mistrust because trust was broken. If we attack the ego without understanding what it protected, we risk turning spirituality into another form of violence against the self. The question is not, how do I destroy my ego? The better question is, what has my ego been trying to protect? Sometimes ego looks like pride. Sometimes it looks like judgment. Sometimes it looks like control. Sometimes it looks like intellectual superiority. Sometimes it looks like spiritual certainty. Sometimes it looks like never asking for help. Sometimes it looks like needing to be right because being wrong once meant being unsafe. When seen this way, the ego becomes less of an enemy and more of a wounded guardian. A part of us that took on too much authority because it did not know another way. The work is not to shame it. The work is to help it relax. That relaxation is not passive. It asks us to notice how the ego defends itself when an old structure feels threatened.
The ego's defense.
Once a belief becomes part of identity, questioning that belief can feel like an attack. This is one reason misinformation is so powerful. It does not only enter the mind as a claim. It can attach to belonging, status, fear, pride, and survival. It becomes part of a person's story, And once it becomes part of the story, correction can feel like humiliation. The ego does not defend every belief because the belief is true. It often defends the belief because the belief is holding part of the self together. Judgment can work the same way. If I can make you wrong, I do not have to examine myself. If I can reduce you to a label, I do not have to feel the complexity of your humanity. If I can dismiss the mirror, the discomfort, or the question, I do not have to change. One way to understand this is projection. The mind may place an unexamined fear, shame, pride, or wound outside itself and then call it discernment. Sometimes discernment is real. Sometimes an old threat response may make discomfort feel like danger. This is delicate work. The middle pillar does not ask anyone to surrender discernment. It asks for a deeper discernment, the kind that can tell the difference between a real violation, a wise boundary, and the ego's resistance to being seen. When the ego can notice its own defenses without humiliation, the next teaching becomes possible. The self it is protecting is not as stable as it feels.
The illusion of stability.
The ego wants permanence. It wants a stable identity, a stable role, a stable future, a stable story. But life does not hold still. The body changes, the mind changes, the world changes, relationships change, beliefs change. Even memory can shift each time it is recalled. What we call me is not a fixed object. It is a pattern in motion. A river can have a name, but the water is never the same. A person can have a name, but the self is always moving. This is not a reason to despair. It is a reason to soften. Impermanence does not only take things away, it also makes healing possible. If the self were truly fixed, trauma could never loosen, addiction could never shift, grief could never breathe, shame could never become wisdom. The frightened child inside us could never grow into a steadier adult presence. Change is not the enemy of identity. Change is the mercy that keeps identity from becoming a prison. The ego suffers because it wants to freeze the river. Awareness learns how to enter the current. When the current is entered deeply enough, even the boundary of I can begin to soften.
Ego dissolution.
Ego dissolution is the softening or temporary disappearance of the usual boundaries of identity. The I grows quiet, the tagging process slows down, the mind stops naming everything in relation to itself. The world is no longer experienced as a collection of separate objects orbiting a private center. For some people, this happens in meditation, for others in prayer, for others in deep grief, childbirth, music, nature, breathwork, love, crisis, or sacred ceremony. For some, it happens through psychedelics. The experience can be beautiful. It can also be terrifying. When identity loosens, the ego may interpret surrender as death. A person may feel as if their name no longer means anything, as if the story they have lived inside is dissolving into something too vast to control. This is sometimes called ego death. But the phrase can be misleading. What dies is not the whole person. What softens is the rigid identification with the story. What loosens is the belief that the narrator is the totality of being. What opens is the possibility that awareness is wider than the self-image. Many people describe what remains as presence, witnessing, connection, love, a sense of being part of something larger than the isolated self. This should be spoken of with care. Ego dissolution does not prove a metaphysical doctrine. It does not prove that consciousness is universal, that the soul survives death, or that any one spiritual system has the final answer. But as direct experience, it can reveal something profound. The self we defend so fiercely is more flexible than it feels. It may not be the final truth of who we are. For some people, psychedelics are one possible doorway into this kind of loosening. But that doorway has to be held with uncommon care.
The psychedelic path held carefully.
Psychedelics, including psilocybin, may temporarily alter activity and connectivity in brain networks associated with self-referential processing. Many people report this as a loosening of the usual boundary between self and world. But this must be framed with humility. Psychedelics do not automatically heal. They do not automatically awaken. They do not make someone wise. They do not replace therapy, preparation, community, or integration. They are not toys. They are not shortcuts. They are not for everyone. They also remain illegal in many places, and legality matters. So do medical screening, psychological stability, setting, qualified support, trauma awareness, nervous system readiness, and a plan for integration. A profound altered state can open a door, but walking through that door requires support, readiness, and care. For someone with unresolved trauma, unstable mental health, unsafe surroundings, or no integration framework, ego dissolution may become overwhelming or destabilizing for some people. What one person calls mystical, another may experience as fragmentation. This is why preparation and integration are not side notes. They are the container. The sacred is not proven by intensity. The sacred is revealed through relationship, how we prepare, how we enter, how we return, how we live afterward. The experience is not the destination. Integration is where the teaching becomes embodied. And integration often begins with ordinary practices that teach the ego it no longer has to grip so tightly.
Pathways to softening.
There are many ways to soften the ego's grip. Meditation teaches the mind to notice thought without becoming thought. Therapy helps us examine the stories that were built from pain, especially the ones we mistake for personality. Somatic and embodiment practices return awareness to the body, where safety must be restored before expansion can become stable. Breathwork can reveal how tightly identity is held in the nervous system. Music and rhythm can bypass the overthinking mind and bring us back into pulse, feeling, and shared humanity. Nature reminds the body that belonging is older than language. Honest relationship shows us where the ego still defends, performs, hides, or reaches for control. Service helps the self mature beyond its own reflection, and beneath all of these practices is a beginner's mind, the willingness to meet reality before the ego rushes to label, defend, and own it. This does not mean becoming naive. It means becoming available again, curious, teachable, less addicted to certainty. Psychedelic work, where legal and carefully held, may open powerful states of connection and self-transcendence, but it belongs inside a larger path, not above it. The ego softens best when it feels safe enough to release its grip. This is why force does not work. You cannot bully the self into awakening. You can only create conditions where the defended structure no longer has to remain so tight. As the grip softens, the chapter widens from the private self to the larger field the self lives inside.
The ecological consequences of separation.
Ego does not only shape the inner world, it shapes the outer one. When humanity sees itself as separate from the earth, the living world becomes an object. Forests become inventory. Rivers become infrastructure. Animals become products. Land becomes property rather than belonging. This is not the main subject of this chapter, but it is an important bridge to later Book 3 material. The same structure that says, I am separate from you, can expand into a civilization that says humanity is separate from nature. The Gaia hypothesis, developed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, offers one scientific and systems-based way of thinking about Earth as a self-regulating web of relationships. It does not require us to claim that Earth is conscious in the human sense. That would be a metaphysical interpretation, not a scientific conclusion. Spiritually, we may experience Earth as a mother, an elder, a body, a teacher, or a sacred presence. That belongs to the language of relationship and direct experience. From a scientific perspective, we can observe interdependent Earth systems, feedback loops, and living processes that shape planetary conditions. Both lenses, held honestly and kept distinct, point toward responsibility. The ego says, I stand apart. Awareness says, I belong. This is where the blueprint becomes more than an idea. It becomes a way of living inside relationship.
From blueprint to being.
This chapter is not only a study of ego, it is a blueprint for becoming. First, we recognize the narrator. Then we see how the narrator was built. Then we notice where it defends. Then we soften the need to believe every thought. Then we begin to live from something deeper than the performance of self. The movement is not from ego to no ego. It is from unconscious ego to conscious identity, from defended self to responsive self, from rigid story to living presence, from separation to participation, from blueprint to being. You still keep your name. You still keep your history. You still keep your responsibilities. You still get to be a person. But the person becomes more spacious, less brittle, less threatened, less hungry to be right, less desperate to be seen as special, less willing to harm the world to preserve a story. This is not the destruction of identity. It is the maturation of identity. The ego becomes a doorway instead of a wall. Here, the pattern is not a song reference or a claim of hidden doctrine. It is a metaphor for the relationships that become visible when the noise quiets. Body, breath, memory, grief, soil, stars, rhythm, relationship, decay, renewal, and love. The pattern awakens when the ego stops trying to own the mystery and begins participating in it. Not as a guru, not as a conqueror, not as a separate mind trying to master the whole, but as a living expression of the whole, learning to remember itself from the inside. This is where the teaching becomes practical. It is not enough to speak of unity while living in domination. It is not enough to glimpse connection and return unchanged to the habits of separation. It is not enough to call the earth sacred while treating the body, the neighbor, or the ecosystem as disposable. The work is to let insight reshape the life. How we speak, how we listen, how we disagree, how we consume, how we repair, how we parent the wounded parts of ourselves, how we stop mistaking the mask for the soul. And once the pattern is understood this way, the final movement of the chapter becomes simple. The ego does not vanish. It learns where it belongs.
The final unveiling.
There's a myth we tell ourselves, that the ego is the enemy. But what if the ego was the preparation? What if identity was the seed, and love was the fruit? You were never only your name. You were never only your shame. You were never only your story. You were never only the voice in your head trying to keep everything under control. The ego helped you survive. Now it can learn to serve. The self does not need to disappear for love to become real. It needs to become transparent enough for love to move through it. That is the architecture of awareness. Not a self destroyed, not a self worshipped, a self aligned, a self that remembers it belongs to the whole. And when that happens, the pattern awakens, not above you, not beyond you, through you, as you.